Okay, and we're back. So today's PowerPoint here is going to discuss something that we didn't really get to before we left for break. We spent a lot of time talking about the New Deal, the Great Depression, the causes of the Great Depression, the Roaring Twenties, et cetera, et cetera. So we really focused kind of on like domestic issues, especially surrounding the economy. But in this particular one, we're going to be looking at kind of that same period of 1920 to 1941, but from a foreign policy perspective. So just as we go through this, and I'm going to kind of keep coming back to this question, one of the a past APUSH exam final free response question, or LEQ as we would call it now. To what extent did the goals of American foreign policy change in the interwar years between 1920 and 1941? So again, as we go through this, we're really looking at, and I know we've talked on multiple occasions about like extent. So we're really looking at like how much did it change from what it was in, let's say, 1920 to what it is or what it was in 1941. So that is the title of our presentation today, American Interwar Foreign Policy, 1920 to 1941. So just a couple political cartoons to kind of drive the point home about this period. It's specifically like in Americans' ideals of like isolationism, right? Like we're separate from Europe and from Asia by two of the world's largest oceans, or I guess I should say the two largest oceans of the world. And so we've always kind of just felt kind of lucky in our isolation due to our like geographic standing. These are a lot of the political cartoons that you guys are going to see today are from Dr. Seuss, and other than writing kids' books, he also makes some pretty racist political cartoons, especially when it comes to Japanese Americans after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we'll kind of see this theme exhibited throughout this presentation. So, if we recall in the years, especially like at the founding of our country and with George Washington's farewell address and his warnings of staying out of foreign entanglements, isolationism was essentially the American way for a vast majority of our history. We do see some adventurism, as you guys probably remember, in the late 1800s, late 19th century, with like 1898, the Spanish-American War, the Filipino War of the early 1900s, the Roosevelt corollary, the Big Stick policy, the building of the Panama Canal, et cetera, et cetera. But really, we're still staying out of like foreign treaty organizations and not really getting involved in the politics of Europe and Asia. But one of the things that's going to mark the period that brings us out of World War I, which again is like one of our odd forays into international affairs, which really the war doesn't impact us all that much on like a war footing, other than the fact that we make a crap ton of freaking money. And we loan a crap ton of money. We become the largest creditor in the world as a result of World War I. And you can just see like a quick little chart here of just how much each country owes us. With a combined total of $349 million, which if you think of like 1918 or 1920 dollars, that's a crap ton of money, right? And at the same time, like, I don't know how much you guys know about World War I, and like, unfortunately, we don't have a bunch of time to get into it. But like, the most important part of the Treaty of Versailles, which ends World War I, is what's called the War Guilt Clause, which essentially blames Germany for all of the violence of World War I, and then kind of tries to put a monetary value on that destruction. As a result of this, Germany is going to start like really pumping out the money. And I think we've briefly touched before on like currency values. The more currency is out there, the less that it's worth. And you can see here that in 1914, for every US dollar, there are 4.2 German marks. by November of 1923, for every US dollar, there are 4,200,000,000 marks. That's hyperinflation right there. I'm sure you guys have heard the story before of like people bringing German marks to the bakery in like wheelbarrows just to buy a loaf of bread. Now, I will say, just as a quick aside, and something that I think is often kind of lost in this, is like most Germans are actually still doing okay. Like they're getting paid. They're just getting paid in like billions of marks rather than, just a few marks. What really happens as a result of the German hyperinflation, though, is this right here. So essentially what happens is after the war, in what's called the Dawes Plan, the United States is loaning Germany money. Germany has traditionally been like either number one or number two as like the most important part of the European financial system. So after the war is over and the German economy is essentially in collapse, the United States is loaning Germany money so that they can rebuild their economy because they are integral and like we have huge trading partnerships with them. Rather than investing that money into their economy, though, the Germans are using the money that we're lending them to pay back the Allies, so like the French and the Russians, for these reparation payments that came out of the War Guilt Clause. The Allies are then taking that money and they're using it to pay back those debts that we saw in this previous slide here. What is really the problem and the huge kink in the plan here, though, is rather than Germany actually using the money to rebuild their economy, they're just printing more money, more and more and more and more money, so that we see that 4.2 billion marks to one US dollar. So as they're paying back the Allies, with deflated currency that essentially has no value. So eventually this is all going to work its way into the global system in a way that, as I think we see when we see the Great Depression, in a really negative freaking way, right? So this Young plan is essentially a plan for the Germans to pay back $26,350,000,000 over a 58.5-year period. Where they get that freaking number, no idea. But $26 billion in 1930 is unpayable. You just can't do it. Like nobody has that kind of money, and it absolutely cripples the German economy. Now, I know that kind of contradicts with what I just said about the fact that they're all still like working. They are, and most Germans probably aren't starving to death. But it is definitely depressing the economic activity of the German economy. Okay, so moving on. Next we look at how the foreign policy system of essentially the global powers plays out in these interwar years. If you'll recall, the United States Senate denies joining the League of Nations. They almost immediately want to return to an isolationist stance, and with Woodrow Wilson essentially being in a coma at the end of his, not that that's funny, at the end of his administration, he's unable to kind of push the Senate into a more kind of like foreign policy or like interventionist kind of mindset. Or I guess I should say internationalist, not interventionist, excuse me. So that is denied, but still people like remember World War I and remember that it really freaking sucked. So what they do is they sign what is called the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. This thing has got literally no teeth, like whatsoever. And when we say no teeth, it means like nobody has the ability to enforce it. It's essentially just a way of governments across the world saying like, we would like this to happen. And what they would like to happen is to outlaw aggression and war as tools of foreign policy, which is just like, come on. Like, if you're not going to try to enforce that in any sense of the word, then, or without any like legal enforcement mechanisms, it's never going to happen. 62 nations sign it, and it's pretty much freaking pointless. So in 1931, Japan, who has increasing imperialist ambitions, especially because, one, I think if you guys kind of look, like, Japan's a pretty small place, a proud thousands-year-old civilization has very little access to raw materials and natural resources. And so they see a very weak but massive and resource rich country to their west. And so in 1931, the Japanese are going to attack Manchuria. They had already kind of like dominated like Korea, obviously, but also some of the islands of the South Pacific anyway. And so now they're moving into the Asian mainland. However, the problem is, like, one, like, nobody's going to step in to stop them, even though this breaches the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which, again, had no mechanisms to stop this. But everybody, like, condemns it. Like, don't do that. Like, they just wag their fingers and realize, like, nobody's actually going to mobilize for war to stop the Japanese from what they're doing. But in the Hoover-Stimson doctrine, the United States won't recognize any of these territorial acquisitions, which I think the Japanese are pretty bitter about, because they're like, how are you gonna like have territorial expansion like the Philippines in our own backyard, but then not also acknowledge ours? But the Japanese are becoming increasingly violent in their imperialist like attacks on mainland China. First is going to be exemplified by the bombing of Shanghai in 1932, which leads to massive casualties, but also what is called the Rape of Nanking, which we'll look at here in a moment. Anyway, FDR comes into office, and he's really like, he has the Great Depression to worry about. He's very international minded in the same kind of vein as like a Woodrow Wilson. But when he comes in, he's like, I have to get people in the United States back to work. I have to get the banks reopened. I have to stop the run on the banks. I have to get industry moving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so really he's going to like close his eyes to what is going on in the rest of the world, and really like even pull back from like the Roosevelt corollary and the big stick policy of his uncle, like distant uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, and what is called like the good neighbor policy. So it's like, hey, like, you respect us, we'll respect you. Ain't nobody got time for any of this crap anyway. So let's all just like kind of try to fix our economies, but like doing it in isolation, which in this particular instance is not necessarily a good thing. In addition, in late 1933, FDR recognizes the Soviet Union, meaning they officially say like, hey, even though, you know, the overthrow of the Tsarist regime in 1918 and the institution of a communist government in Russia, which we have refused to acknowledge as being a legitimate government, now we're going to do that because they believe that they're going to support the Russians as a kind of backstop against further Japanese expansion into the Asian mainland, as well as develop a better trading relationship with the USSR in a time when like American industry is like, hey, we need people to trade with. Maybe Russia will do it. Ignore this. I probably should have taken these slides out. If you want to read through it, go for it. But this is just kind of a blame game thing, and they're not super wrong, but essentially it was like an investigatory committee that said that the only reason we got into World War I was to like supply and support the war industries and make the quote-unquote merchants of death a ton of money, which they did, and which I guess if we look at what happens as a result of World War II may have actually been pretty correct. Okay. Neutrality, Old Man Sea, we'll come just get through those. Okay. So as fascism begins to spread in Europe in these intervening years, and this will be the last slide that I'm going to do for this particular one because I'm already inching toward the 15-minute mark. Sorry, I talked too much. The most significant acts that are passed during the 1930s are the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37. Essentially what it is like, one, if you go to war, we're not going to sell you arms. Two, we're not going to loan you money, much like we did to everybody in World War I. Two, we are going to forbid Americans to travel on vessels of nations at war, which essentially was like what led to the United States' entry into World War I with the sinking of the Lusitania. Additionally, non-military goods must be purchased on a cash and carry basis, meaning we are not going to transport your goods, and when you do come to pick them up, you're going to pay cash for them. So we are not then therefore loaning money to belligerent nations. You better come with the cash in order to buy our goods. So I'm going to leave it off for there until the next one. Thanks, guys.